Welcome, everyone. We're here today to do the final session of Nourish Diversity with Kind Theory and nutritionist Rebecca King. You all know who we are by now, but very briefly, Kind Theory is a neurodiversity-based nonprofit in the Texas area, but serving across the United States, mostly through online programming like what we have here today. I'm the board chair, Dr. Laura Z. Weldon. And Becca King is a registered dietitian and nutritionist who lives in North Carolina. She specializes in disordered eating in general, but has a particular focus on people with ADHD, which is what we're talking about today. If you're here, we don't have a huge crowd today, so I think if you want to speak up, please go ahead. We don't have to keep us formal with these housekeeping rules, but just be polite and don't interrupt Becca while she's speaking, please. And today, here we are at month 6, building confidence in the kitchen. And our activity today will be reducing cooking overwhelm. So with that, I will pass things back to Becca.
So today we're going to talk about building confidence in the kitchen, or hopefully just some ways to reduce some overwhelm in the kitchen, because I think cooking itself can be overwhelming. And so finding some ways to simplify and delegate, or even take out parts of the process just to make it easier can be really great. And maybe hopefully finding a little bit of fun or enjoyment in the process. I know that not everyone enjoys cooking, and that is totally okay. But hopefully maybe just some ways to maybe, at least when you're doing it, if you do choose to cook, to make it a little bit more enjoyable too. So, and yeah, feel free to make this conversational too, since there's just a few of us here. But I'm going to talk about why cooking can be overwhelming for ADHDers, identifying some different areas of overwhelm, some strategies to simplify cooking, as well as making it more enjoyable. And then at the end, we'll kind of go back. At some point through this presentation, we'll kind of talk about the different parts of the cooking process. And then during this activity, we'll go back and we can brainstorm some different ideas during the activity of if there's a certain spot in cooking, you're like, oh, this is really overwhelming, or I dread doing this, or it takes up too much time. There's just a barrier for me to even do any of this. Finding some ways around that, and learning from each other too, because I think all of us probably have different tools and strategies when it comes to cooking that we can either use to make easier for ourselves as well. But some reasons that cooking can be overwhelming. Sensory wise, there's a lot going on. So different smells from the food, sound, textures, even just visual stimuli can all trigger sensory overwhelm. So it's very easy to get overstimulated when we're cooking, especially if we are cooking multiple things all at the same time. There'll be a lot going on there. Fine motor skills as well. So chopping, measuring, stirring, all those kinds of things in the process sometimes can be more challenging if you have challenges with fine motor skills. I know for me, chopping and things, reasons I don't make a lot of cooking videos on social media is because I know people would be like, that's not how you do this. And I'm like, it doesn't matter because I get it done. It's not glamorous all the time, but it works. I think the biggest one is executive function challenges. It literally requires every part of our executive functions to cook. So things like organizing, prioritizing tasks, and activating tasks. So just getting started, focusing, sustaining, and shifting our attention when we're doing tasks. There can be a lot of different little tasks going on at the same time while we're cooking. Regulating our alertness, sustaining effort and processing speed as well. Managing frustration and modulating our emotions can be challenging when we're cooking, especially if something doesn't go right, or you skip a step or something, can make it more challenging. Utilizing our working memory and accessing recall as well. And then monitoring and self-regulating action as well can all be challenges when we are cooking. Perfectionism, that shouldn't say that. It should say as well as, the F should not be there, I apologize. But it should say as well as anxiety, can create that mindset that every meal has to be perfect or we've somehow failed. I think sometimes we hold ourselves to restaurant standards with a lot of when we're cooking, and it may not have to be that way, and that's totally okay. So yeah. Yeah, needing it to be super healthy or have all the components of a meal sometimes. And, you know, if we feel like we can't do one part of it, or like, oh, I didn't have any vegetables because all my vegetables were bad. So like, oh, well, now the meal's not okay. Or but maybe something doesn't sound good and so you don't want to make it or something like that. It's also a learned skill. So like if you haven't spent a lot of time in the kitchen, I know for me, I did grow up in a house where I was involved in the cooking process and things like that. So I learned some of those skills as a kid. And so I think that that can be helpful if you do have kids to consider incorporating them in the cooking process. But as an adult, I think acknowledging like if that wasn't something that your family did or your caregivers did with you, it's totally normal to be like, this is really hard for me. I've met people who like left my house and when I graduated high school and like I couldn't even tell you how to scramble an egg. And so there's a big learning curve that can be there. And then we can be very impatient as well. And some recipes require a lot of patience and are sustaining attention. So being able to sit there and watch something and see, you know, as this thing is browning, or does it change color or get fragrant in a certain way, you know, to add different ingredients after that, it can be a little overwhelming. And we could get very distracted. Our kitchens may be places where there's a lot going on in your kitchen. So it might be like, oh, I'm working on this. And then you might see something and get distracted by that and forget that you are working on a recipe or things like that. And there might be other things too that make cooking overwhelming. Are there any other things you guys can think of? Yeah. Yeah, definitely super long. I find recipes where I have to be actively standing in front of the oven or stove and cooking can be, I may or may not have the patience to do those.
Yeah, for me, there's often a physical component too, just
Cool.
like when your body's dealing with other things, like just the act of standing for that long is really exhausting.
Yeah, especially at the end of the day too, like you might just not have that same energy that you might want to have, or you might pick a recipe and then get in the kitchen and it's like, I don't quite have the rest of the energy to do all of this. So there's some of this. Yeah, I have some friends that have like the little like my parents have one too, the little like memory foam kind of cooking mats in front of the stove just to help with like making it a little bit better for standing. I did not appreciate those until I had to work in a kitchen. And then I was like, oh, these make a really big difference when you have to stand and chop for hours at a time. These little pad things make. I'm not going to chat about meal planning today, just because we talked about that in the June session, I believe it was. So if you're someone watching this recording and meal planning is something you struggled with, if you did not attend the June session, definitely go back and watch that one because there's some great stuff that we talked about there. Oh yeah. Yeah. Sometimes as having too many people in the kitchen, yeah, that can definitely create overwhelm, especially if everyone's sitting there talking and having different conversations or interrupting you while you're trying to pay attention to something, can definitely make it a very overwhelming. So I'm going to go through some of the different steps in cooking. We'll dig into some of these a little bit more in a second. But after we get our, you know, go grocery shopping and meal plan, all of that, when we start cooking is kind of where I'm starting from here. So first step would be like gathering our ingredients and the utensils, doing some sort of preparation, checking in with timing as well. And like, there's probably a heat source that you're gonna have to use. So you might want to ahead of time preheat that thing. So like the oven usually takes a while to heat up. So you might need to do that kind of at the beginning of the cooking process. Again, so we don't start like, hey, I prepped all my ingredients, but I can't stick it in the oven yet. And then there's that impatience piece that might come in because it might take a little bit of time. You might have to add some sort of fat in cooking. That's very normal depending on the cooking method, so that you can use whatever pot or pan or thing that it is. And then there's different cooking methods, depending on what the recipe calls for, and you do different things in these different processes. And we'll talk about this in a second. And then we plate our food usually and serve it. eat it, and then the cleanup process usually after the fact. For some people, you might be skilled enough that you can kind of clean up as you go. I think that's probably a little bit more advanced personally. So if you find like, oh, I can't do that, like just waiting until you're done cooking and eating and dealing with the cleanup after the fact might be a little bit easier to start. My partner is a chef, and so it's like our cooking styles are like completely different, because he'll be like cleaning and it's just a no-brainer for him. He really doesn't have to think that much about doing the cleanup along the way, and he'll come in when I'm done cooking and he's like, it's a disaster in here, and I'm like, but I made a meal and that's it's done and there's food to eat, so it's okay. So with gathering your ingredients and utensils, you want to identify those things, obviously. Reading the recipe is probably a good place to start if it's a new recipe or something that you are following along. If it's something you've made a million times, you probably don't need to go read through the recipe. You probably know some of the things you need, but totally okay if you need to go review. Getting out the utensils and things you need to in advance can be helpful, so that you're not trying to do it alongside as you're doing prep and cooking and all of that. It just kind of makes things a little bit easier. Some people, as well as looking through the cooking times, the suggested cooking times probably might not be how long it's going to take you. It might take a lot longer in terms of the prep part of it, especially like the cooking time itself will probably be similar, but how much time after the like prep, I always add some time there. So Laura, did you want to share something?
Yeah, this is the part that my executive functioning is the hardest time with. So when I'm reading a new recipe, I think it has to do with like if they add enough content, then you can copyright the recipe as a piece of writing. So there tends to be a lot of extra words that don't need to be there. And I find that in a recipe like that, I have to go back and read it over and over and over again throughout, and it's really hard. So if I'm really committed to doing something new and a little more complicated, I'll print the recipe and highlight the actual action items that have to happen so that I don't have to like reread all that extra thing. And I find that that's really helpful for me.
Yeah, I personally like the printed version, like my meal kit thing. I use a meal kit right now, and they sometimes one week they've had me use the app to like look through the recipe, and that was really hard on my phone. But having the like paper copy of the recipe, and there's usually like a couple pictures sometimes you can get some with some recipes. There's some places you can look online too for like visual recipes, and they can show you like kind of the steps and what you're doing if seeing is helpful. Or if you find a recipe, sometimes they'll look, if it's like a blogger type of person, if they've made a little video of like how to do things, I'll kind of watch that video a couple of times just so I kind of get an idea of like what the different steps look like too as well. And I find that's a little bit easier. And sometimes I've even gone and like kind of edited their recipe because they'll kind of combine steps together that I guess maybe in their head they're like, this is one step, and I'm like, this is two different things. You told me to turn on a pan, and then you told me to chop vegetables. Those are two different steps, but they'll just like combine it and be like step one, and I'm like, those are two different actions. Like they don't need to be together. So I'll kind of like edit it to make sense for my brain a little bit more. And then when you gather those utensils and ingredients, it can kind of just help having them out again and somewhere visual for you. And you could even group them together if you wanted to. I know some people will like, I've seen some ADHDers will prep if they do go to the grocery store and decide what ingredients or recipes they're make in their fridge. They might have little bins to put the ingredients for each of those recipes. So then when it's time to cook that thing, you don't have to like search around and get all the things. You can kind of pull out like whatever in the fridge that you need. You can just pull out that bin, and then it's all pretty much in there ready for you. You might need to grab some other stuff, but it can kind of simplify some of that a little bit too. That's one thing I do like about the meal. Some of the other meal kits, not the one I use, it just comes with all the ingredients in a box, but like HelloFresh and some of the other ones, they'll kind of package it for you in a similar way. So then it's just grabbing them, and it just makes that little piece of the process a little bit easier too. And then the prep piece, which is probably, let's say, the part that can be very overwhelming along with cooking, but prepping can definitely be hard. Mise en place is something that I always forget often to do. So some of these things you could write somewhere or kind of cue you, you know, to do so that you know that like, hey, I should probably do this. It looks nice and pretty to do in advance. You don't have to use a bunch of pretty bowls and things like this. But sometimes just actually when you're prepping them, you know, getting everything done before you actually start the cooking process, because it gets very overwhelming if you are like turning on the stove and like, okay, now it says chop this, or like, oh, I'm going to go back and start cutting everything after I've already started doing it. I remember making an Instant Pot recipe and I didn't do this, and I was so overwhelmed because it was like, brown this, and you had to quickly add something in. I was like, but none of that's ready yet. And I was like, ah. So this can be a very helpful tool. You could get other people involved too to help with prepping if there's like age appropriate tasks too. Like if you have kids and you want to get them involved, this could be a place where you do that. It could be like, hey, can you help me wash the vegetables? Or can you help put these things after I cut them in a bowl? Those little kind of steps just to make it easier. Or if you have a partner or someone else who wants to be involved, you guys could do it together. And that can be a way to just take some of the pressure off of you. But this helps just make everything accessible. And so it's there. And that way, when you are working through the recipe, you can just add things and you don't have to go do the prep and then add it in. It just makes things a little bit simpler. With prepping ingredients, all those different ingredients are probably going to take some time. Like when I review recipes first before I start the cooking process, that's kind of how you can set things up. If you look at, usually the ingredients will tell you how it should be made, and they don't always include those steps in the cooking process. It's just like, it's magically supposed to be chopped like this. And you're like, in my brain, that is a step of this process. So doing those things first can be helpful. And other things like proteins, you might have to like trim the meat or chop it up or do like pat it dry, those kinds of things. You might want to do that in advance. Spices are another one if you can set up in advance. Sometimes even if just putting them all in one bowl, you don't have to separate them all out so that they're all ready to go, depending on what the recipe calls for. Sometimes fats will have to be measured out if you're cooking with like oil or butter or ghee or something like that. You might want to measure it out in advance so it's just easy to add in. Or if you eyeball it, I don't always measure that part of my cooking. I just drizzle it in there. But over time, I've gotten better at kind of knowing about what I need to like be, usually it's like 2 tablespoons or whatever it is. I kind of know what that looks like, which can be helpful. And starches might need a little bit of prepping if you include those in your meals too. So does anyone have a part of the prep process they find particularly overwhelming? Or you hate doing?
I mean, I also find that this is a really, really helpful step that I don't always do. And it's a good reminder that it actually does make the cooking process easier and more fun.
And it can look a little, at least if you like to look aesthetically pleasing, things like that. It's like, ooh, look, I have all these things ready to go as well. Yeah, if you're not a big chopper and you don't want to pay the ADHD tax of getting pre-chopped vegetables, they have little veggie chopper things, and they're a little bit easier to use than actually having to chop things up with a knife, because you can just put the vegetable on there and close it. And you can change the little blades out so that it's cut to the right sizes, which is great. And then everything's kind of uniform as well. I found some ADHDers like that. Like if you do want to prep vegetables or things, that might be a way to try it so that it's already done and you don't have to. I know for me, sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, I decided I'm going to make this roasted veggies and potato like sheet pan meal. And I'm like, there's so much chopping involved in that. I'm like, man, if I had that tool, it would be a lot easier. So some ADHDers, I'm sure they find that that's a little bit easier. Or even frozen vegetables that are pre-cut, you can always add those to recipes and things like that as well. And it's not on any of these slides. Prep-wise too, from a sensory perspective, like if you don't like handling or don't like the textures of certain foods, like wearing gloves while you're cooking can be very helpful. If you handle raw meat, you probably afterwards want to take them off and put a new pair on, just from a food safety perspective. But I know for me, like I don't always love touching raw meat, especially. So having gloves can make that a little bit easier, especially if you have to like marinate them or really be hands-on with the food. It can make that part of the process feel a little bit better. And my dad had to get them for something, and I was like, I never thought about this. And then I was like, oh, this actually makes it a lot easier to do, because like, oh, I just personally don't like touching all that. So I can make it a little bit easier. So with simplifying the cooking process itself, thinking about the type of recipe you use, these are some types of recipes that might be a little bit easier to do compared to something that maybe uses like 5 or 6 different, types of pans and things like that. I like sheet pan meals. You can kind of cook and walk away. The nice part about sheet pan meals, I find I can do some of the cleanup while things are in the oven, which is nice. The slow cooker is a good one. Like if you know you maybe have a really long day and you just want something to be done when you come home, it definitely requires a little bit of remembering to do in the morning or on your lunch break or whenever you start cooking it. But that can be a great one. Instant Pot is kind of like a much quicker way to use a slow cooker, but you can cook so many different things in there, and really nice recipes in there too that I like. Air fryer is also great. I like that because you can cook from frozen. So if you forget to thaw, or the same thing with Instant Pot, if you forget to defrost something, those two can be really great because you don't need to remember to do that. And the air fryer is nice too, because if you don't have to like preheat the oven and do all of that stuff, so you can kind of just put it in and cook, and the cook time's a little bit faster too. So from like a patient's perspective, sometimes I find the air fryer is nicer than like doing a sheet pan meal, where I'm like, okay, I know the sheet pan at a minimum is probably like a 40-minute recipe, but if I cook this in the air fryer, it'll probably be about half the time. One pot recipes can be really great too, just because there's less dishes and things like that. And they're usually like nice because it's all combined. If you like combination types of dishes, it'll all be kind of combined together and tasty. So does anyone have any preferences for recipes they like to make?
I have kind of like a standard formula for easy. I have a lot of dietary restrictions so this is not necessarily advisable. Like, please add more protein. I'm not saying this is the suggestion, but I'll often make like a gluten-free pasta or rice as a base. And then I am adding a vegetable, an herb, and a cheese or a tofu. And so I just like swap whatever happens to be there, but kind of keep that formula. And then it's like, I don't even have to look at a recipe. I can just kind of make food.
Yeah. Yeah. And it can be that way. Or sometimes if like energy wise, like if doing all the cooking is hard, it might be like more of like a assembly style meals. Is what some of my clients will refer to them as, like where it's like, yeah, I'm just reheating. Maybe like, yeah, maybe I have some tofu I'm throwing in the air fryer, and I have like a 90-second bag of rice and some frozen veggies. I'm just gonna mix them all together and make like like a tofu stir fry kind of thing. But it's like, they're like, I'm not like cooking and doing all of the steps and prep. And I'm like, but it still counts as making a meal. You are nourishing your body, and that's what matters. I've been my clients, I'm like, hey, if we're at a no energy day and heating up a can of soup in the microwave is what is going to be cooking for you, then like allow that to be cooking, and don't be like, oh, I'm not cooking. This is still, it very much counts as making yourself food. It's you're still not, spending a ton of money on takeout or whatever it is. You're still doing something for yourself. So some looking at time as well. So like hopefully some recipes will put the prep time and the cook time, which is nice. Because the prep piece is usually what will take the longest, again, especially for us if you struggle with like chopping and things like that. I usually just add time on. It might double the time on the recipe, and then it's like a nice little surprise if it takes less time than what the recipe calls for. But I always add some time to the suggested time, just knowing that, especially if it's the first time I've made that recipe, there's probably going to be some hiccups in that process, and that's okay. But just giving myself a little bit of grace in the time that it might take me to do something. You can always time yourself too. So you can write that down by the recipe, like, hey, this is how much it actually took me to make this or to prep this recipe. And so that you cross out their cook time and say, hey, it's probably what it's going to be for me if I want to make this recipe again. Visual timers can be really great. I know some of us use them in other places for ADHD, but having one in the kitchen can be really great. just to have awareness of how much time has passed, or if you know, okay, I have 10 minutes that this thing needs to be simmering on the stove, you could set it for 10 minutes so you don't lose track of time. And it's nice because they'll ding and let you know. I know sometimes when I put it on my microwave, if I use that timer, I'll just kind of forget, I don't see it while I'm cooking. So having a little tool there that I can actually see in my visual space can be helpful. The number of ingredients you use can be, I would say, less than 10. 10 still I would be on the higher end of things. I always search for like 5 ingredient or 6 ingredient recipes when I'm looking, if you're looking for recipes, because they tend to be simpler. So there's lots of food bloggers I absolutely love, but then I'll go look at their recipes and I'm like, I don't have all 20 of these spices. And if I don't like this recipe, then I'm going to have all of these spices and things that I'm not going to use again. And they're probably expensive. So finding some that don't have a lot of recipes, or if you can build a formula like for Dr. Lauren has, it can be really helpful to have like, okay, I have a base. What's my protein? What's my like veggie kind of thing? Is there any herbs, spices? I kind of call them like fun or pleasure foods. Like what can I add to this to make it satisfying in this experience? For me, eating experience, utilizing shortcuts. So if there are parts of that prep process that you really don't like or find overwhelming, giving yourself permission to utilize some shortcuts can be really great. Like for me, discovering minced garlic or even just pre-peeled garlic was a game changer, because like I don't want to get my fingers, I love garlic, but I don't want my fingers to smell like garlic for forever. So it's nice. It was just one less step in the process. When I discovered minced garlic, I was like, I love fresh garlic a little bit better, but if this is what makes just one little step take, because mincing garlic for me could take, 10 minutes for me to do sometimes. And I'm like, okay, just opening a jar and putting that in there is under 2 minutes, and that's good. So finding some of those little shortcut kind of things can be really great. I use again, I don't like touching meat, so like pre-marinated meat sometimes are really nice. Even like tofu you can find that's pre-marinated, and it's nice if you're not someone who is very familiar with prepping tofu and things like that. I find they're nice because you don't have to do the pressing and getting all the liquid out and doing all of that. It just saves a step in the process with things. And there's lots of options for things that are shortcuts too. So
So I'm not a huge fan of the whole prepping time and, just making chopped vegetables and all of that. But then when I think about whether it's healthy to have pre-chopped veggies, frozen vegetables, or pre-minced garlic,
yeah,
I get really scared because I don't know if that's healthy. So I am not sure. Would that be an effective way of dealing with this? Or
I will say from a frozen food perspective, frozen produce like fruits and vegetables are just as healthy, if not more nutrient dense than fresh produce, depending on where you live. Because sometimes, especially like if you live on the East Coast, a lot of our food doesn't always come from the East Coast. So a lot of our produce will travel really far distances to get to us, and it can lose some of its nutrient quality when that happens. But if we're getting frozen produce, it's flash frozen at like the peak of its nutrition. So it can actually be just as good. There might be things like with chopped vegetables where things might have like be sitting in like a liquid that has something in there to help preserve the shelf life of it a little bit. But I wouldn't say any of those things are particularly like super harmful for your health. I mean, if it's the difference between eating a vegetable and not eating a vegetable, I would say that eating the vegetable is going to outweigh it. It's the same thing with like organic versus non-organic. Like it's kind of the same thing. The nutrient quality itself is really not that different. So like if you had to choose like, oh, I can't afford organic produce, not that you necessarily have to consume that, it'd be better to have even canned or frozen or fresh, just conventionally grown produce and things. So there can be additives, like if you're sensitive to certain things and you know that you are sensitive to certain like preservatives or additives to food, then you might want to check the label to make sure those things don't exist on there in them. But overall, I would say they wouldn't detract from like your overall health. So
All right, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yes.
I wanted to add blender to the list, the wonderful list here.
Yeah.
I love my Vitamix because sometimes like the sensory element, like you're talking about touching everything just gets too much, and also the time. So we're in peak tomato basil season right now, and I chop a tomato in half. That's all it takes, and throw like 4 of them in the blender with like garlic, olive oil, and basil and salt and pepper. And it's a fresh tomato sauce that requires me to touch hardly anything. So
Yeah.
I use
Yeah.
that a lot for soups and sauces and things.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's just the most tedious part of the process. I think one of them. Yeah. Yeah. Vitamix, immersion blender is another one too. If you don't, those usually are a little bit more affordable, but great options too to like blend things up. Really want an immersion blender to make soups. I always find soups and they're like, and then blend with your immersion blender. And I'm like, I don't have that. But yeah, that's a good one too. Blenders can be great. And if you ever need a hack to clean your blender, if you put a little soapy water in there after you've used it and then put the lid back on, obviously, and let it run for a little bit, the soapy water will kind of get all the whatever's left over in there kind of out and cleaned, and then you don't have to like scrub with soap and a sponge. So.
Ooh, that's a good hack. That's
Yeah.
actually good. I'll give it a try.
I always try, and when I share like me making a smoothie or something like that, I always try and put that step in there or leave it like on a recipe if I share one with people, so it helps with the cleanup process. So ways to make cooking more enjoyable. And again, I know that some people really don't enjoy cooking, so you might not get any joy from cooking, and that's totally okay. But maybe some of these strategies can just make it more of a tolerable experience. Listening to something, it could be music, you listen to a podcast. If you like having TV shows on in the background, that could be something you listen to. Like for me, I love listening to Frank Sinatra while I'm cooking. There's just something like nostalgic about it for me. And music's a little bit soothing. If you find like too much going on, you could consider, if you're just by yourself in the kitchen, like or not having people around because you might not be able to hear them as well, but like some of those noise reducing kind of earplugs or something like that could help as well. If like you have kids like sitting in the kitchen doing homework and talking and things, that could be a way just to reduce some of the sensory overwhelm there. Getting other people involved can also help with overwhelm. So delegating parts of cooking or cleaning, inviting people over. If you don't have people that you can cook for, if you find that more rewarding, even if it's just to have people sit with you as well, can be nice. Or just like I've called friends or FaceTime them and like, hey, I'm cooking. I just need you to like sit and chat with me while I'm cooking. And it just makes it a little bit more enjoyable, or I can bounce ideas off of them. I'm like, I don't have this. What could I add in here? And kind of talk with them that way. It just makes it a little bit more enjoyable. It can be an opportunity to practice mindfulness, which might sound kind of weird. But when you are like chopping vegetables or cleaning things, just trying to view it like connecting with your senses and kind of slowing down. It might not be able to practical to do all the time, but if you have moments where it's like, hey, I actually feel like I'm doing pretty well today, or like there's not a lot going on and it's like maybe a slower evening and you have more energy, it can be a moment just to connect with the food as well, which I think can be nice. And then documenting it could be another way to make it more fun. So like you could share, if you make a recipe or something and you're really proud of it, like sharing it to your friends on social media, or you could even keep like your own little food type of journal, not necessarily like a food blog, but like a food journal. Just if there's new recipes you've tried, you could snap a picture of it and you could, like rate it out a scale of 1 to 10, or would I do anything differently next time, just to keep notes of things and journaling your experiences. Or like, hey, I learned a new cooking skill, and like writing about doing that if this is something, you're kind of working on. So does anyone have any ways they like to make cooking a little bit more enjoyable?
So I actually listen to music while I'm cooking.
Yeah.
I think and that's with me when I'm studying as well. For some reason, I think if I have music going like in the background, it helps me focus.
Yeah,
So yeah, I enjoy doing that.
yeah. And it's nice because you can kind of reminds you to also have a little bit of fun. Like when if you're like in the song, you can kind of dance along in your kitchen, and enjoy yourself in that kind of way too. But yeah, if you find music is a helpful tool for other tasks, you can always add it in. Oh yeah, that's a good way to do it too. I recorded myself the other day. I was not in the mood to cook, and I just recorded myself like, and it was really, I could just laugh at myself cooking because it was a little all over the place, but I was like, it's all right. This will be comical to myself. But yeah, you can pretend like you're on a cooking show or something like that. That can be a fun one too. If you're someone who's like, but I don't really know how to cook at all, or I don't have a lot of skills, just some ideas for building up some skills. Cooking classes can be really great. There are some you can do virtually, which would be nice because you're going to be in your own home. So you would be using your kitchen tools and in your space. So it can help you get a little bit more comfortable. You can also do things in person, and you could go, I know some places will make it like a date night kind of thing. But you could always go in person and just have, or go with like a girlfriend and have a girls' night, or do something like that, or just making it a group thing that you can do together. But you can learn from people and learn different hacks and things, which can always be nice. Cooking shows can be an opportunity to learn more too. The struggle meals, I really like this one. It's on Taste Made, which is like, I think a YouTube TV type channel or something like that. But I really like them because it's like how to use very basic ingredients that you have probably already in your house, and the guy teaches you very basic cooking skills, like how to make a roux and things like that, of just very not easy things, but things you might not know how to do otherwise, and how to get creative too. Like he kind of will get like, there's one part of the episodes usually where he'll get like some random ingredients and has to come up with a meal with those ingredients, and so he kind of teaches you how to think through like, what could I make with this and how do I do that. So I really like his stuff. It's and very simple, and he has a good attitude, and it's also about how to make cooking affordable as well, like very affordable recipes and things too. So I think that part's nice. The Fat, Salt, Acid, Heat, I believe is on Netflix, but a lot of people like that show and find it very helpful for like learning more about cooking and the combination of things and how they go together, of like, how do I make certain flavors and things, go together so you can make a meal. Cooking competition types of shows can be really fun. Some of the ones where people aren't skilled experts, those ones can be really great, where they're like bad cooks and things like that, because they could show you like common mistakes that people might make in the kitchen and how to fix them. So those can always be like some good ones. Like I don't always watch the like super professional ones. So some of the ones I like are like, there's like the Guy Harvey grocery store one's kind of fun. There's another one where they stand outside a grocery store and they ask people to buy their groceries, and then whatever's in those bags they have to come up with meals for, and it's kind of fun and on the fly. But they're not like always super professional chefs, which I think is nice because it's usually realistic recipes that they're making and not things that I'm like, I would, never make a recipe that Bobby Flay is making. That's just probably not going to happen, and that's okay. But it can give you some ideas for things too. If you are ever feeling stuck or bored with things, it can be also an opportunity to find some new things you maybe want to try. Social media is another place you can always find people on TikTok or Instagram making different recipes and things like that too. There are some Facebook groups too, for neurodivergent folks, with sharing recipes and food hacks and things like that. I can share the groups with you guys, the link to them for people who listen, and I can add them to like the notes for the YouTube video. I can't remember them off the top of my head. One of them's like neurodivergent, but make it food. And then there's another one that's just like, and I like them because they're all usually weight neutral. So there's no like diety stuff in these groups either, which I really like. And there's no shame and judgment either in these groups. So it can be people being, sharing. I saw one girl once who had like a little fruit like a thing of berries, and she had added some cheese and some other things in the little berry container to bring to work with her. And she's like, look, I have a little cute, like like on the go charcuterie thing. And everyone like congratulated her, or just, very realistic recipes like you can find on there from people, or people that are really supportive and understanding too. If you're like, I'm struggling with cooking, does anyone have any, recipes for things you can eat in bowls? And people will share all their favorite things. So it's those environment communities can be really great. Embracing your failures too. If you're someone who's learning how to cook, you're going to fail in the process, and that's totally okay. Maybe keep a couple frozen meals in your freezer just as backups, in case it's like, okay, this is really not edible at all, there's no way I can save this. But just view it as part of the learning process. And remember, it takes time, persistence, and then practice to build new skills in the kitchen. So the first time you make a recipe, it's probably going to be the hardest time that you have making that recipe. And the more you do it and the more you practice, like, it gets easier and easier over time. And you'll start finding new skills and building those. And starting simple, like if you are someone who doesn't have a lot of cooking skills, don't pick really complicated recipes to start with. And that can be a good way to learn. When I was a kid, like a kid's cookbook might be a good place to start with some visuals, and very simple recipes. To start, I still have the cookbook I have from when I was a kid, because I really like some of the recipes in there, and they have very easy to understand instructions, which is nice too. So, did you guys add anything to this list? Or any of them seem helpful? Yeah. And if you try new recipes, if you're someone who finds cooking overwhelming and stressful, like, I maybe consider when you have the most energy to try new recipes, or trying them like on a day where there's not a lot of pressures, like a Friday night or a Saturday, when like it's not like, oh, I have to make this meal and get the kids ready for bed, or do all the things, to get ready for my work day tomorrow. Those things might be helpful too. So that way there's not as much pressure on you to like, oh, I can't mess this up because we have to eat this dinner and then I have to go do a million other things. Of picking a day when there's not as much going on, or when you have more energy or capacity to do so too. And yeah, I always cook time. I try and pick recipes that are 30 minutes or less. Anything more than that, I'm like, I'll pick on a day when I really, really, really want to cook and like spend time in the kitchen. But I usually pick even my meal kit, and you look for the ones, because you can search by time, and I pick 30 minutes or less, knowing it'll probably take me more than 30 minutes, but that way it just minimizes as much time as possible.
One other thing that I'll do if I know I'm making something that is going to take a lot of everything, so definitely pick like a Saturday or a Sunday, but also I will make more of it. So like if I've done it before and I know it's not going to totally fail, I will try to make 1.5 or double and freeze it, so that I have like this nice extra meal that I've already done for myself.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah. One of my friends, she'll do that. There's these little, oh gosh, I can't think of the name of them now. But there's these little, they're like silicone storage container things. And they're made kind of for food prep, but that's what she'll, like if she makes mashed potatoes, she'll make a bunch extra and then put them in there. So then they freeze in little cubes. Oh, they're called super cubes. That's what they're called, like soup ER cubes. They have a bunch of different sizes, but they're like nice because if you do prep things, you can kind of put them in there and freeze it. So she'll do like mashed potatoes even or whatever, and put some sides in there if she makes extra. And then she'll put them in a baggie later on. So she already has like a pre-portioned little thing of like, okay, cool, I have mashed potatoes in the freezer and I can add that to a meal or whatever. If there's little parts, you're like, oh, I have extras of this. You can use it for soup, obviously, and things like that too. But yeah, there's a cool little gadget. We also can be really great cooks. I just wanted to touch on some of the reasons or some of the things about us that can make us great cooks. So I know, because I've always posted about why cooking's overwhelming, and then I'll get people in my comments being like, Well, I'm a chef. It's not that hard. And I'm like, okay, well, this is probably your special interest area. So like this makes sense as to why it's not overwhelming for you. So I just wanted to highlight some of those things. Like we can get really hyper focused and use that to, do a lot of work in the kitchen. We can be really great at multitasking. So if you are comfortable in the kitchen and you have skills, that multitasking might be really rewarding to you. Can solve problems and be adaptable to. And the sensory experience, it could just be fun to be in the kitchen and like get to taste food. If you don't find it overwhelming sensory wise, it might be an enjoyable place for you as well. So yeah, definitely. I would be interesting to see if there's like a correlation between the two. But yeah, I find a lot of times if you're a pure super taster, you might have a much more selective palate, which is not a bad thing at all. You just probably have a lot more stronger preferences for things. So the first 2 pages just kind of go through all the processes that we've talked about today. And so having you think through, we can touch on some of them or however much time we have left. If there's any ideas or ways you would think about maybe simplifying or delegating or even removing that step in the process. So we'll start with gathering the ingredients. Are there any parts of this process that you guys find overwhelming?
I've just moved, so I find this part is taking me 3 times longer than normal because nothing is in, I don't know where everything is automatically. I have to think and kind of look for it.
Yeah.
So yeah, just there's no system right now for where things are, and that feels kind of chaotic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to get used to in a kitchen. I know some people even will label things if that's helpful too. Like getting a little label maker. So like in your pantry, it's set, or when you open up your cabinets of like cups are here, or this is here, just so you kind of know, generally speaking, what might be in there. And being flexible too, with like moving things around. If you find like, I've definitely set up my kitchen before and then rearrange things because I'll find, oh, I'm always going to this drawer thinking there's utensils in there, and then it's just silverware. And I'm like, well, if my brain is saying that the utensils are in this drawer, like, why don't I just flip the 2? So that way, like being able to be flexible, it's like, okay, I did set it up this way, but I keep going and like turning this way and thinking this thing is here, of kind of adapting it a little bit and changing things around. And make more sense as you kind of figure out the space too. That's a good one. Are there any processes with preparation? I know there's a lot of them, but any parts of that process that feel overwhelming?
I'm struggling with this activity, Becca, because you did such a good job in the presentation of coming up with all the examples and solutions that my brain's like, oh, we already have something to try for that.
Well, if you want to talk it back, you're welcome to.
Well, the idea of getting all the pieces out, both the tools, like having the bowls and the utensils and the food items all ready to go. And then especially the pre-measuring, that like mise en place idea, like the chopping. And also for me, I get really hung up when I'm real adamantly against the 3/4 measure because it requires 2 separate spoons. So doing like getting that out of the way at the beginning, it will help everything else feel more streamlined.
Yeah. And even having, you can get some magnets. I have a cute little like print that I got from like the Target dollar section one year. But if the conversion things are things that you struggle with too, like if you are adapting a recipe or something, you can buy little conversion magnets to put on your fridge of like how many teaspoons are in a tablespoon and all those things. So if you have like a weird measurement and you're like, I don't know how to do this, it can help you kind of figure out doing some of that math if you're not as familiar with it. Having that as a little tool. I have one like that for in measurements, and I also have one for like food temperatures too. You can find if you forget those things, just to remember like I can't remember what temperature chicken needs to get cooked to or whatever it is, just so you know that like, oh, this food is heated through and cooked. I can give you feel a little bit better. I know some of them too will even put like how long you can store food. There's a bunch of different kind of like magnets for food tip things, but you can get them. Like I found one for storage of like how long you can keep certain types of leftovers, like between fish and chicken, or if you cook vegetables, or if you cook rice, like how long those things can stay and how to store them. You can find little tips on that too. So that way you don't, I know for some people too, like the fear that food might not be good anymore, or things like that, having that as a resource can be really great just to calm some of those anxieties. If you're like, oh, I can't remember if I'm supposed to keep, I had hard-boiled eggs on Sunday and it's Sunday of the next week. Like, can I eat these if I didn't finish them? Like, you probably might want to throw them away, and that's okay. But having some of those can be great for that. Any shortcuts you guys would consider using in the preparation process?
Definitely frozen chopped vegetables.
I like using, especially though, like, oh gosh, I can't remember the right term for it. But like celery, it has different names depending on what part of the country you're in, but like celery, carrots, and onions, like if I need that as a base in some recipes, if that's like the main chopping piece, I just have to add that as like a base somewhere, buying like the frozen versions of those, or the pre-cut ones too are really great, because it's like, well, I can just dump this in there and it's good to go. Yeah, I love frozen veggies, even getting this like frozen ginger cubes, and you can find basil sometimes, or garlic, things like that. If you don't want to get like a jar of minced, you can always get the frozen ones. Those will be probably a lot fresher, which is nice too, to save some steps in the process. So
Keep a lot of herbs in the freezer too. I clearly have a backup freezer. This may not fit in my main freezer, but I'll go like to the farmer's market and buy them in bulk when they're really cheap. And most of them you can just kind of like put out on a cookie sheet, freeze them, and then put them in a little jar. And that way I don't ever have to think in advance of like what I have on hand. I know they're there. I know they're decent quality. And
yeah, and then you don't feel the guilt of like, I just bought this huge thing of cilantro and I only need a little bit of cilantro, and then it's going to go back to the rest of it. Like, what am I going to do with this whole bag of cilantro kind of thing? It can help with like at least reducing some of that waste too, which is nice. Smart. Yeah, if you can do it. If I could design an ADHD refrigerator, it would be like a bigger freezer section and like a slightly smaller refrigerator section, because I find the freezer is just a really great tool for ADHDers. So you could get rid of like the crisper drawers, just remove those and add that as freezer space, and then the rest could be the fridge. It would be a lot more ADHD friendly. So
yeah, we would actually see what was there. It wouldn't go bad.
Yeah, I would at some point. I might have to get a second freezer at some point, because it's just hard. The little refrigerator freezer just doesn't always do it. And then cooking, it might be hard to see on the screen. But I mentioned that with this handout too, for anyone watching the recording, there's kind of different ways to explain like what these different types of cooking, what they mean, if you're not really familiar with some of those terminologies. Some of them might require more time and energy or being involved, than other parts of the cooking process. So the other night what did I do? I had to use the broiler for a sheet pan thing that I made, and I was like, go do something. And then I came back and I was like, oops, broiler is one you can't really walk away and go do anything. And I came back and I was like, the veggies are a little bit darker than I wanted. That's okay. Yeah, the broiler, you definitely have to be paying attention for that. So. And then a part we didn't really touch on, but cleanup. Any parts of cleanup you guys find overwhelming?
I usually hate doing the dishes. They take a lot of time, and I feel like it's really overwhelming. See, I enjoy doing the rest of the steps apart from preparation. That's a bit tricky. But other than that, I enjoy cooking. And then when I see all of the mess that I've made and I have to clean that up and do the dishes as well, it's just too tiring.
Yeah. Yeah. I am the Tasmanian devil at the end. And then at the end, I'm like, oh my gosh, how did I do all of this? So yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I find if you can give yourself a little time or space in between, like I will like rinse everything off. And if I don't have the capacity right at that time, I'll go do something else and come back to it. Gloves here are another great place from a sensory perspective. If you don't like touching cooked food or food that other people have touched, having some gloves can be nice because you can kind of be a little bit more hands-on while you're doing the dishes as well. So yeah, or you can, another place you could, if it's safe for your kids, if anyone has kids, to get them involved in the dish part of the process. If you really don't have capacity to dishes wise, like buying some like compostable like paper plates and utensils just to have as a backup for in times when you're like, hey, every so often I might not have time or have energy to do all the dishes, and having that, or if you know, like I run out of things, like I get all the dishes in the sink are full and I need a plate or I need a fork or I need something, having something that's maybe disposable, maybe compostable too, to be nice to the environment. So that way you have a little backup there, or buying extras of things like like spatulas and things I use a lot of, but might not get to like getting my whole dishwasher cleaned. I'll have extras of like spatulas and some of those utensils I'll just get from like the dollar store somewhere, just so I have some extra tongs and things laying around. So if one's dirty, I'm not like, man, now I'm gonna have to wash that so I can use it. I'm like, I'll just add it, get another one. And it's just usually the ones I use a lot of, like even the little like teaspoon and tablespoon measures. We have like 2 or 3 of those, just because sometimes like in that process, it's like, oh, this has like, for baking, if I've put honey or something in there where it's like this liquidy and it's sticky, I'll just get a different one and use it so I don't have to like go wash it. But having some multiples of things, if you can make cleanup a little bit easier too, if you need to. But yeah, giving yourself permission if you need to do that. I use the little sheet pan kind of things. You can the silicone ones you could put down on baking sheets can make sheet pans, or I'll just put like a layer of foil when I do a sheet pan, so I don't have to like scrub my sheet pan when it's done. I can just kind of bundle up the foil and put it in the trash when it's done, and that feels so much easier to me to be able to just rinse it off versus like when you've roasted something and all the stuff is on the pan. It's just a lot harder to clean as well. And sometimes I'll just save things. Remember, you don't have to be perfect and get all the dishes done all the time. So like if it feels easier to be like, I'm going to do, like earlier this week, I was like, all right, I finally got to the end of the day and got enough energy to clean all the dishes in my sink. And I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to do all of them, but there was a sheet pan in there that I just didn't have the energy to do. So I did the rest of it and left that for the next day. I was like, that's okay. Like we did some of it, and that's better than not doing any of the dishes. So probably just like, if you can, rinse things off, and so there's no like food things hanging out in your sink, but just get things kind of rinsed, and you can always leave in there if it's like, I can't get to this right now, but I can get to it later on as well. I'll gamify the dishes too sometimes. So I'll do like if you remember the game show Minute to Win It, I will turn my little visual timer on and be like, okay, 15 minutes. How many dishes can I get done in 15 minutes? And try and race the clock. And usually once I get going, I can finish it, but it's just kind of makes it feel a little bit more fun, or listening to music as part of the cleanup process too can make it a little bit easier. But yeah, don't have to strive for perfection when it comes to cleaning things too. So.
There's one piece of that where I have to delegate to the sensory aspect of cleaning the food out of the collection in the sink. It's just like a past level for me, just like cannot do it. So I will clean up, all of my stuff, and then I will tag my partner in who has not as much sensory issues. It's like, I'm going to need you to do that last piece just for
I definitely, when I'm was in my internship, I lived in a place I didn't have a disposal. And so my first place, once I started working, I remember touring this was a nicer apartment complex, and they were like, anything you're like specifically looking for? And they have all, they have all the bells and whistles. I'm like, a garbage disposal, and the look on her face was hilarious. Like, that's what you care about, and like, that's what you want. And I was like, yeah, I need a garbage disposal, because doing that for the year that I lived in that house was enough. I don't like that. So yeah, that's one area that finding some garbage disposal was a game changer. I was like, okay, I can do that. That I can do. Like, go down the drain and I never have to see you again. It's a little bit easier. So well, thank you guys so much for having me and for hosting all of these sessions. I hope that anyone watching the recordings has gotten some value and learned some things from these sessions. But I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. They've been wonderful, Becca. On behalf of Kind Theory, thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise. It's been fun and to learn from you. And I'm excited that these resources will be available for more people.
Yes. And thank you guys for offering such accessible services for everyone.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Take care, and hopefully we'll get to reconnect with some exciting projects in the future.